that all of these sessions are being recorded. So welcome back. And Juveria, in a moment, you're going to have to unmute yourself. But we have, I'm quite excited that we have Juveria Veldkamp speaking with us from the Canada Climate Law Initiative. And this, as with many of the other organizations, but this one perhaps more specifically is something that the Ivy Foundation was involved in at the outset and helped to establish in Canada. It was initially a project that included, in fact, it was called the Commonwealth Climate Law Initiative, and included University of Oxford and UBC and Osgoode Law School and a law firm in Australia. So it's been a fun project focused on how we actually get companies and corporate directors in particular to better understand climate risk and the duties of directors around their fiduciary obligations. So without going into the details, Juveria, thanks so much, and I really look forward to your talk today. Thanks.
Hi, yes, hello and welcome. Thank you for that introduction, Bruce, and that is our background at CCLI. I'll talk about it a little bit more. Bruce, congratulations again to you for being recognized as one of Canada's net zero climate champions in the lead up to COP26. And thank you for being a host for this session today. It's my pleasure to deliver this session on climate risk and disclosure. As Bruce said, next slide, please. My name is Juveria Veldkamp, and I'm director of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. We are connected with a global network of similar hubs, initiatives around the world, including Oxford University in the UK, Australia. We've done work with Japan, Singapore. So we bring all this global best practice together to catalyze effective climate governance across Canada. So climate change has arrived and already has a material financial impact. And what this means is this reality is reflected in the responsibilities of corporate directors and anyone who has a fiduciary duty to govern or steward an organization. So CCLI delivers this much needed foundational research and tools that can help guide directors and trustees to deliver on these obligations. And with support from funders, including the Ivy Foundation, thank you, we offer free confidential presentations actually to boards across Canada on the importance of climate risk and how to get started on delivering credible climate disclosure. Next slide, please. My background is in business and economics, and I've worked in the climate change and green economy space for the past 16 years. Prior to joining CCLI, I led green economy strategy for the city of Vancouver to introduce low carbon local solutions and to grow green jobs. Prior to that, I did work in green buildings as well for several years. Next slide, please. Starting with a bit of context. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world had this focus on financial stability, much like with the pandemic today. Are there other risk factors that we might be overlooking or underestimating or failing to prepare for that could lead to generalized global financial instability? And green swans, if you've heard the term, are one such risk. So green swans are climate-related disasters that can have such a wide-ranging and extreme impact that they could cause this financial disaster scenario. Our entire society is predicated on the assumption that we have a stable climate, where we plant our food, where we think it's safe to build and live, where we locate critical infrastructure, and that climate is stable no longer. So our models that rely on historic patterns are no longer good predictors of future performance. So in 2015, the Financial Stability Board, which is a group of world central banks, They established the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Many of you will have heard of this, TCFD. And the idea is it creates a framework for organizations to identify and then report on climate risk, with the idea that then the financial system can price that risk and mitigate that risk. Next slide, please. So green swans are kind of like the black swans, if you've heard of those, characterized by uncertainty. So you can't use historic data to predict them. They have these wide-ranging, unpredictable impacts. But unlike black swans, they're not unexpected and they're not rare anymore either. We have a high degree of certainty that climate risks will materialize. Some have materialized already. The insurance sector has seen payouts for severe weather damage double every 5 to 10 years since the 80s. With TCFD and other governance frameworks in the UK, a prudential framework, that they start to look at climate risk in these two categories. First is what we immediately think of, I immediately think of, is acute and chronic physical changes in terms of hurricanes, sea level rise, wildfires, events that disrupt supply chains and can curtail household earnings, erode asset value, and so on. Then there's transition risks that can do the same. So as we respond and attempt to address and limit the physical impacts of climate change, we price carbon, we invest in new technologies. These then change the profitability or viability of certain sectors of the economy as well, or even households. So for example, some organizations are responding with a shadow price on carbon. A carbon price is going to change your profitability. So can you start to reflect that cost of carbon now and be ahead of the game for when carbon pricing arrives? So these physical and transitional risks play into financial risk through these transmission channels of how businesses are impacted, how households are impacted. And then left unchecked, these financial risks are what could turn into a green swan, and that's what central banks don't want to happen. Next slide, please. The TCFD framework that I mentioned also encourages organizations to think about opportunities in the transition to a low carbon economy. In 2019, I led a project in Vancouver to examine the opportunities presented by this transition by climate policies in BC. And we looked at BC's Energy Step Code and the Vancouver Zero Emissions Building Bylaw, which I'm sure has been mentioned on several presentations already. And we quantified an increase in demand for 6 categories of green building products as a direct result of this climate policy. For those perhaps not familiar with BC's Energy Step Code, very quickly, it sets out a staircase of gradually improved energy performance over several years, nudging builders towards the pinnacle of net zero energy by 2032. Some jurisdictions in BC have layered on emissions reductions requirements, which is not a core focus of the code. And in Vancouver proper, there's a separate zero emissions by 2030 plan. So we use the engineering models that had been created for the purpose of the policy development, and we built an economic model that then quantified a $3.3 billion market for these 6 categories of clean technologies, including windows and doors, heat pumps, heat recovery ventilators, and so on. Next slide, please. And you can see the report on the website of the Vancouver Economic Commission, but we estimate that $3.3 billion is really the tip of the iceberg. Our model was for demand in Metro Vancouver, but the code applies everywhere in BC, so our estimate may only capture half that possible market. Also, the code is written in a way that municipalities can leapfrog ahead if they like to higher levels of performance. And at the time of writing, if all the municipalities who have said they plan to do this actually do this, this number could increase another 30%. And finally, it does apply to new construction projects. So that's what we modeled. which is about 50 to 75% of construction activities. So demand from retrofit projects for some of these products could drive an increased demand as well. So the information from this study creates sort of a crystal ball that is an investment planning tool, whereby manufacturers, suppliers can see these inflection points. We have all the graphs in the report where demand for lower performing products goes away. And hopefully this means they can time investments into new product development, new machinery, technology, reskilling, growing their staff, service staff to serve the demand for these low carbon technologies. So this is decision useful information that an organization can integrate into strategic planning decisions. Next slide, please. In that way, the TCFD framework can allow us to combine financial and non-financial information and then highlight how this climate risk or this opportunity plays into financial risk and value creation. I have a question. I think we're going to wait for that to the end. If you are engaging with a board on this matter, and I hope you do, whether it's a corporate board, your corporate board, or other fiduciaries, for instance, if you want to ask the Canada Pension Plan Board as a beneficiary about their climate strategy, those are the kinds of things where this is really illustrative. If you're engaging with boards and other fiduciaries on this matter, the TCFD framework elevates the discussion about climate change to this board level. And in the next few slides, I'll outline 5 reasons that a board or anyone else with a fiduciary duty, your RSP manager, needs to put climate risk on their agenda, ideally using the TCFD framework. Next slide, please. So number 1, the direction of travel when it comes to regulating climate disclosures is really clear in Canada and around the world. Canada's budget last month outlined that Canadian Crown corporations will now be required to disclose climate risk. Canadian securities regulators are clear that disclosure is required. In the US now, the SEC is also traveling in the same direction and enhancing requirements for climate disclosure and other ESG risks, environmental social governance risks. And jurisdictions around the world, several are rolling out plans to make this mandatory. And the language in these disclosures, what companies are required to disclose, is also getting more comprehensive and standardized. Many of us in the space who are watching, you will know that sustainability reporting standards are out there, and it's not for a lack of standards, but rather a prevalence of choice in standards from SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, or Global Reporting Initiative, or GRESB for real estate. So a lot of these standards are converging to create a unified framework to integrate sustainability data into financial reporting, as with GAAP accounting principles that are universally acceptable. So this is a big shift, big game changer. And in the EU, there is also a common green taxonomy. So a common language with uniform criteria to identify what is green economic activity and what isn't. There's a similar taxonomy in China. Canada has one under development. This lexicon is really important because it standardizes definitions of green so that we can avoid greenwashing and allow better benchmarking. Next slide, please. So number 2, why climate risk is a boardroom issue. Investors care, and they want credible, consistent, and comparable data on climate risk in order to mitigate this risk in their portfolios. And if you cannot provide this information, it can impact access to capital, cost of capital, and investors want this decision useful, credible information about how an organization is embedding this in their long-term strategy. So in the same way that disclosure of energy performance data can be used to reassess asset value, benchmark performance, identify retrofit opportunities, climate risk data can help reallocate capital towards low carbon solutions. Next slide, please. Number three, on why this is a boardroom issue, statutes and common law fiduciary obligation in Canada is actually clear that there is a duty on directors to address climate change. And this is the crux of what we do at CCLI. We conduct this foundational clarifying research about this obligation. We have, Bruce was mentioning earlier, we have free toolkits, we have guides for audit committees, we have a guide for the insurance sector. We're developing guides for real estate and construction as well. And we deliver presentations to boards in a confidential, safe, collaborative space. And the whole design is to help directors appreciate how their oversight responsibilities and due diligence requirements extend into climate change. Because, and in our materials, you will see that there is uncertainty perhaps when it comes to climate impacts, but that is not an excuse for inaction. And all risk management is about dealing with uncertainty. So in our research, directors can be wrong, they can't be negligent. And the bottom line is that Canadian courts recognize climate change is a danger. They accept that it is undisputed that human-driven carbon emissions are a cause. And someone explained it to me, I'm not a lawyer, but you don't have to prove climate change is real in a Canadian court anymore, in the same way you don't have to prove the sky is blue. So I think that's a real distinguishing difference. Next slide, please. Number four, climate is a boardroom issue because of the potential for litigation. Now, there hasn't been climate litigation in Canada against corporations, but the number of cases around the world has nearly doubled in just the past 3 years. And the majority are still against governments for issues such as domestic enforcement of climate commitments or others about keeping fossil fuels in the ground. There was a legal opinion released last week that says governments that finance fossil fuel exports through export credit agencies could face a higher risk of litigation. So one case in particular is interesting. It's about breach of this fiduciary duty or disclosure obligation. And in Australia, for example, one employee sued the retail employees superannuation fund, so it's a pension fund, for failing to provide information related to climate risks. And in that case, they settled, and the pension fund agreed to now incorporate climate-related financial risks into its investment, and it set a climate target as well. Next slide, please. And finally, number five is really about getting started. It's a steep learning curve, and it's easy to give into analysis paralysis. Boards must start evaluating completely new to them non-financial data. Their teams have to learn to collaborate in different ways, in cross-disciplinary ways. They need to start thinking in terms of future probabilities, not just historic patterns. And these are things that in green buildings, you have all been doing for a long time. So, you and I know it's not impossible. There are many resources, but you need to get started. And it's really a case of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Encourage boards, organizations to get started. It's a journey and we will improve, but we have to get started. In Canada, 27% of TSX listed companies, for example, have set emissions reductions targets. Although we are behind our US and European counterparts. Next slide, please. And of that 27%, a large number of companies don't have a clear plan on how to get there yet. Canadian organizations have been a bit on the fence and perhaps slow to get started. So we are playing catch up, but there are a lot of tools now, Canada specific, experts, many in our network who we can connect you with at CCLI, who are out there, really committed to increasing, leveling up our game around this. And when, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to regulators and investors, this boilerplate language around climate action is not going to be enough. We need detailed, credible net zero transition plans. We need to grow that 15% piece of the pie considerably. There is a trend to tie executive compensation to climate targets and ESG targets, a very effective tool to incentivize integration of climate considerations into organizational decision-making and performance. And next slide, please. So in closing, I think I have enough time. Yes, so I remember reading a report by Microsoft, Harvard, MIT, and others, and they wrote that the technology to fight climate change has been available for years. It hasn't been deployed at scale yet. So there's a sustainable pathway. We still have to select it. I do have phone calls with people where climate change is one of those issues they don't want to talk about perhaps at work because they don't want to talk about politics at work. And my organization, and I know many of you are committed to creating tools and resources to help illuminate that climate change is not a political issue, it's a business issue. And it's really important that we keep shifting people into that problem-solving mode, I think. So I think TCFD is an important tool to be able to do that. We could be facing 3, 4, 5 degrees of warming if we don't act and change the path that we're on. And, you know, to some, that still seems a little bit hard to kind of fathom. It may seem inconsequential, a couple of degrees, but the Ice Age, there was a study just came out earlier this year. The Ice Age was only 4 or 5 degrees cooler than today. And that was a totally different and very difficult planet to live on. So climate action requires that business realign their strategy and set measurable, credible goals and targets. Any type of change in that category needs the board to provide oversight and leadership, and TCFD helps elevate this discussion of climate change to that board level. Last slide, please. So if you know a board that would like to discuss these issues, we offer a free and confidential space to get started, as I mentioned. We also have an online climate governance knowledge hub where you can look at resources for directors, for policymakers, you know, for others as well who want to learn about the space. And it's at ccli.ubc.ca. So thank you for your attention, and I'd love to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Joria. Oh, for some reason my video isn't starting, so I hope you can hear me okay. We have a few questions here. Just gonna try, no, this is not a video. Okay, start my video. Yeah, for some reason my camera just decided to not start. So you can hear me though, Joria?
Yeah, I can hear you, Bruce.
Okay, yes, great. So I apologize.
Right,
I'm gonna probably just have to reboot my computer after this session.
okay.
So the first question we have is, are there any guidelines or methodologies on how to quantify different climate risks beyond high, medium, and low?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Great question. Thank you. There are a lot of tools. I would say that it is a new space, but I believe there is a paper from the Institutional Investors Group, which outlines lots of different climate risk assessment methodologies and how to assess them. And so I guess I'll try and not go into too much detail, but you know, there are integrated assessment models. These bring together the economic piece, the energy technology selection, the policies, the climate impacts, and they have scenarios for 2 degrees, 4 degrees, and how that might impact in the future. And then there are a number of organizations that can build models to bring that down to how that impacts you at an asset or an operational level. You're going to have to balance how expensive you want it to be and how detailed you want it to be. But there are off-the-shelf tools like the International Energy Association or IRENA or just the UN IPCC models that sort of at least lay out potential futures that you can assess against. But then if you want to get to a state of really measuring your climate value at risk, There are much more refined tools that, if you're on the building side, will be able to look at your portfolio and assess how much potential damage there is to assets and to calculate your portfolio, value, climate value at risk. If you're on the agriculture side, there are much more targeted tools that could look at declines in yield rates and determine your value at risk that way. So it's really, there are a lot of tools. You have to balance how technical you want to get, but there are frameworks that even if you're at the first level, that off the shelf things that are available that are not that will be cost effective. I hope that answers the question, and I'm happy to take other questions outside of the conference to get more detailed if people would like.
Yeah, that's great. And we have a few more here. A comment that they totally agree with the framework, saying it's puzzling, however, that more than one of Canada's big 5 banks still lends great sums of money to the oil sands and related projects. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a very important framework. I think, from my perspective, the fact that this is coming from the financial sector in terms of central banks, there's a lot of forward momentum. So I think it is a TSN turning point in that sense. I think we will start to see a lot more change. And when it comes to the banks, I mean, I can't comment on what climate risk methodology they might have used to inform their decisions, but I know that there are networks of, for instance, Global Alliance for Banking on Values. There are the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, and a lot of the signatories, bank signatories to these frameworks are saying they are going to assess the climate risk of their lending. Credit unions like Van City have a goal to decarbonize their lending by 2040. So there is a lot of move. And if you look at the compensation, I think it was only this year that a lot of the banks announced more alignment of to incentivize their executives with ESG disclosure, at least, and climate goals and targets. So I think you're right. I think there's a lot of room to shift, but I'm also excited that we have a lot of tools and frameworks now. We're not carving the path. The path is there to adopt and embrace.
Great. Thanks. And maybe I'll toss in a couple of comments as well on this issue. We do quite a bit of work on sustainable finance, and I would say that it's really only in the last year that the banks have like fundamentally started to rethink how they deal with net zero and climate change going forward. And they have a lot of money out there right now in the energy system. The energy system, of course, is a big part of the Canadian economy. So I think, and this is why, so financial products like transition bonds are really important for Canada, because we fundamentally need to finance the transition, and banks, I think, will be very much part of that. And I think it's going to take many years for the banks to go through this transition financing phase, which will be a combination of cleaning up some of the existing oil and gas companies, and also transitioning into kind of related fuels like hydrogen that'll probably still rely on natural gas in the interim. So that would be my comment on that. And now I'm going to go on to another question. So how do energy efficiency retrofits in buildings mitigate climate risks for the building owners?
That's a good question as well. Thank you. I think when it comes to climate risk, we're still using GHGs as a proxy in many senses to measure exposure to climate risk, which is kind of, I don't think long term that makes sense. And I think it's a very new space. And so climate risk is, as I said, there are now agricultural models to look at how yields might be impacted. There's sea level rise models to see which assets could be at risk from sea level rise or flooding. So it's an evolving space, but if you look at what a shorthand is to, and especially on the transition side, because of the advent of carbon pricing as a transition risk, the quantity of GHGs and GHGs emissions are still considered a proxy. Does that make sense? So when it comes to retrofits and GHG savings and emissions reductions, it's still part of the suite of data that you would look at when you assess climate risk.
Great, thanks, Jabari. Maybe I can just add on to that.
Yes, please, Bruce.
And I wonder too, with with the combination of accelerated carbon pricing in the system, and for example, even if you look at things like the quality of like air quality in buildings, heat resistance, things like that. Are there would those be considerations just strictly beyond greenhouse gases? So in terms of lower operating costs, higher tenant retention, all of those things, do you see those as part of the climate risk calculation?
Yeah, I think maybe not the calculation, but I think climate risk is systemic. So we're not talking about it in a vacuum, as you started to talk about, Bruce. These things are related to, if you take housing, sustainable housing, for example, it's about occupant comfort, it's about transit and walkability and connectivity. So again, I think the buildings place is such a great place to start, because we've been thinking about how these things integrate together, whether through LEED or WELL for many years. And it isn't just, climate isn't divorced from the discussion of equity and social well-being and economic development.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm not sure why I'm feeling so inclined to weigh in on all of these, but here's another really great question. So as part of TCFD fiduciary responsibility around risk management, with respect to future development and construction flood zones, are developers being informed that building in those areas deemed potential flood risk are high? I guess, are their premiums adjusted accordingly to the risk, or simply, could you put no payout for future flood damage?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, we have provided our insurance sector guidance, and this is, the canary in the coal mine, in a sense. The insurance sector has been talking about this for many years because they've seen those claims increase. I think uninsured claims are still 70 or 80% of a lot of the extreme weather related damages. Anecdotally, I know I'm in a townhouse strata and our insurance has gone up 25%, and we've been told to expect it to go up 25 to 30% for the next several years. But that's a good question, how in Vancouver, and it's going to be location specific. So in Vancouver, who is insuring you for what? I'm sorry, I don't think I have an answer, Bruce. I would invite you if you have something there.
Yeah, I don't have a precise answer, but I know just a couple of thoughts and to dig into this further. So the federal government announced considerable funding around emergency, like flood mitigation, et cetera, which isn't the same thing. I mean, what you're saying is how to avoid that here. I know also, sort of anecdotally, that there is, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, of course, is very active on these issues and has done tons of research on flood risk and cost, insurance costs related to increased flood risk in Canada. And they're, really, I think, leading a lot of this research. So they're interested actually in having building codes that would, and when I referenced earlier in my talk this morning, the idea of sort of a resilient building guide for buildings is modeled after, kind of EnerGuide, but really around things like flood risk. And so I think the idea there would be, and this would be, more of a, I guess, a third-party sort of certification system that would recognize what the flood risk is in the same way that EnerGuide would for buildings. And I know, in fact, this is just an anecdote. I'm just going to only say this because we've got a little bit of extra time here, and one more question. When I was in Hawaii a few years ago, in the good old days when you can go on vacations, and it happened to be during the volcano, and I'm very interested in volcanoes, and so toured the area, and the local person that was touring said that the homes were built in an area that was designated as the highest risk for potential lava flows, and therefore they had no insurance. And those were the exact, so whoever did the mapping, got it exactly right, because all those homes were destroyed by the lava. And so I know in Canada, again, somewhat anecdotally, there's often political pressure placed on the insurance industry to not have exemptions for coverage, because it's difficult, of course, for people to not have insurance for these things. So
That's
a lot of
really, yeah.
interesting stuff going on in this question. I think a really good one. So go
And
ahead,
also,
sorry,
just very quickly, Texas, I think if we continue to do that, are we at more risk of just continuing to build and put infrastructure where it's at risk? I know that Catherine McKenna, for Canada Infrastructure anyway, wants to have a climate lens for projects going forward. But it's interesting how that plays out, like in the city permitting or that space. It's a really good question.
Yeah, exactly. I think the bottom line is there needs to be more thought, and I think more stringency placed on these kinds of, I would agree, not having payout for people that are building in known floodplains. This doesn't make sense. And a final question for you, Juvario, is does financial disclosure discriminate between carbon offsets and carbon emission elimination as initiated by corporations?
I'm trying to think that one through.
Yeah.
Well, not to end on a negative note, disclosure I think is important, but disclosure in some cases could be, we don't think we have any risk. That's our disclosure. So the quality of disclosure is certainly something that CPA Canada did a analysis of, like, so we're doing TCFD disclosure, there's a 27% we said have a climate target. What's the quality of this? And there's a lot of room for improvement around that. Offsets, I'm trying to think of offsets. Offsets may be a way to, I'm not sure how to answer that question, actually. I'm trying to unpack it.
I'm once again happy to jump in on this. Fundamentally, this is the benefit of disclosure. And I think it's not so much the, financial disclosure discriminating between these things, but the marketplace being able to make a determination as to whether a carbon offset is significantly or substantially mitigating the carbon risk versus an actual carbon emission. So the clearer the definitions, the more data, the better the disclosure, the easier it is for the market to really make a determination around the risk. And so I would suggest that we need to have these kinds of definitions very, very clearly understood and agreed to and standardized, so that the marketplace can really make a decision.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it would depend on the term, right? It may be a short-term mitigating factor, but in the long term, depending on the price of carbon, it may not provide that kind of hedge.
Yeah. and it may not fundamentally really get at the business operation of a company that is fundamentally at risk of producing a lot of carbon, and you can't just buy your way out of the solution, I would
Right.
suggest.
It sort of hides the inefficiencies.
And I think with that, we're going to close off. Excellent questions once again. Thank you so much. And thank you, Javaria, for your presentation. And I look forward to seeing you all in our next session.